This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open a file that was never meant to be found. In the spring of 1812, the ledgers of the old estate at Whitcombe were found sealed behind a false wall in the study. 2 volumes, leather-bound, heavy with dust, and stamped with a crest that no one could identify. The ink had faded to rust, but the handwriting, precise, elegant, unshaken, spoke of someone who had written without doubt, without mercy. Each page listed transactions, names, dates, sums of money. But the amounts were strange, inconsistent, and sometimes beside the name of a person came no number at all, only a small black mark in the margin. At the bottom of the first page was a single sentence, written in Latin: Omnis debitum solvitur sanguine. All debts are paid in blood. The estate itself had long been abandoned by the time the ledgers were discovered. Local stories called it the House of Accounts. Children dared one another to look through its broken windows at night. The few who claimed to have done so said they saw a light, soft, golden, like candle flame, moving from room to room as though someone still walked the halls, keeping the books. But the truth, as always, had roots deeper than superstition. The house once belonged to Lord Edmund Whitcombe, a man known in his time as both philanthropist and predator. He had inherited not land, but debt, and from debt he learned power. In 1796, he began lending to neighboring estates, first to farmers, then to merchants, and eventually to peers who had gambled their fortunes away. He kept everything recorded, every transaction, every secret. The ledgers became his confessional. And like all confessions, they were written not for forgiveness, but for control. By 1803, Whitcombe's fortune had grown beyond counting, but wealth did not soften him, it sharpened him. He began to demand more than payment. Collateral was not just land or title. Sometimes it was people, servants pledged by their masters. Daughters promised to his service until the debts were cleared. When they failed to return, it was said they had gone north. No one asked further. The ledger entries changed after that. The numbers stopped. Only names remained, each followed by a small cross. Dozens, then hundreds. And beside one entry, unlike the others, a single drop of ink, darker than the rest, pressed so deeply into the page that it had bled through. The name was Lydia Harrow. Lydia was 17 when her father lost his estate to Whitcombe. The story, recorded in the village account books, was simple enough. She was taken in as a companion to Whitcombe's ailing wife. But in truth, she was collateral. A living entry in a book that could not be balanced. Witnesses recalled seeing her once, months later, at the edge of the estate's orchard. Her dress was torn, her hands stained dark as if with ink or blood. After that, she vanished. When the ledgers were found almost a century later, scholars traced every name they could. Many were real. Most had no graves. And yet, the handwriting remained steady across the decades, as though the same hand had written long after its owner should have been dust. One historian noted that the last recorded entry was dated November 12, 1854, 40 years after Lord Whitcombe's death. The handwriting was identical. No explanation was ever found. The ledgers were eventually taken to the county archives for preservation, where they remain under lock and temperature control. But the staff who catalogued them made an odd observation. Every winter, when the air in the vault turns coldest, a faint stain appears on the glass of the display case, small, circular, the color of old ink. It fades by morning. No one touches it now. The historian who first translated the Latin motto wrote in her report, "The ledgers were not accounts of money, but of promises. Each name is a vow, each vow a kind of ownership. He believed in payment beyond death." And in the last page of the second volume, where there should have been a signature, there is only a single line written in trembling script. The account continues. They sent for her in November, the month when paper feels brittle and breath hangs close to the face. The letter came from a solicitor in York, written on heavy stock with a crest embossed so faintly it could have been a thumbprint. It informed Dr. Miriam Harrow, historian of small reputations and long patience, that an elderly client had died, and that among the effects was an item pertaining to your family by right of descent. She was to attend, if convenient, before the 15th. Convenience has never governed the living or the dead. She went. The firm's office was narrow and warm, lined with shelves that made walking feel like reading. The solicitor was the kind of man who had learned to breathe without moving his shoulders. He offered condolences with a voice that did not belong to sorrow, then slid a box across the desk. It was cedar, iron-cornered, and latched with a key that felt warmer than it should have. "The deceased," he said, "wished you to have this without public inventory. She believed you would understand its contents." "Who was she?" Miriam asked. "A Miss Elspeth Anstruther, the last private owner of the Whitcombe Estate." The name settled in the air the way ash does. Miriam carried the box back to her flat and set it on the kitchen table. Outside, rain worked itself thinner against the glass. She turned the key. The lid released with the sigh of old wood. Inside lay a ledger, one of the ledgers, wrapped in a fragment of black silk. Beneath it, a note written in a hand that trembled but did not waver. "Dr. Harrow, I have kept this from those who wanted it inventoried and displayed. You will see why. The last entry concerns you. E.A." The first pages were familiar from reproductions in the county archives, immaculate columns, names like tally marks of a vanished parish, the little crosses that meant something other than burial. But the farther she turned, the more the book seemed to tighten in her hands, as if the binding itself resisted a stranger's touch. She stopped near the end, not at the final page, but at the final filled one. A date, November 12th, 1854, the name below it in black, that had outlived its century, Lydia Harrow. Her surname, a coincidence possible in any county of England, and yet not here, not now, not with the silk still breathing the faint scent of old smoke. She turned the last page. The sheet was unlined. The paper had not yellowed like the rest. Something that signed in the same fastidious hand, had written 3 words on the exact center of the page. The strokes were fresh enough that the ink retained a sullen sheen. Miriam Lydia Harrow. Her middle name had been her grandmother's. She had never used it in print. Beneath, a blank line waited like a held breath. No date, no amount, only the expectation of both. She did not sleep that night. The box sat on the table with the lid open, the ledger half closed like a mouth that had said enough for the moment. At 4 in the morning she made tea and drank it cold. The old house across the street took to creaking, as if something inside it wanted a word. In the gray hour before dawn, she did what historians do when stare meets a story. She went to the place where the story had grown. The road to Whitcombe wound through fields that had learned to be poor. The estate stood where rumor had always put it, high enough to see the river's curve, low enough to take its mist. The lodge gate was long gone. The stone posts at the drive were tattooed with lichen. A modern chain kept out those who required such reminders. Miriam stepped over. The main house lay farther back than photographs suggested, as if time had pushed it away out of courtesy. Windows like blind eyes. The front door, once black, now a color the rain had invented. She found an opening not through grandeur but through the scullery, because houses confess through their work first. Inside, the cold had a shape. Every room held it differently. The study, when she reached it, felt as if the air had been pressed flat and ironed smooth. The false wall that had once hidden the ledgers was no longer false, only repair upon patch upon apology. She leaned her ear to it and heard nothing but the quiet, the living, keep for the dead. There were marks on the floor where the desk had been dragged and replaced over decades until it wore a shallow groove, as if the house were a mill, turning the same grain of day again and again. On the mantel, someone had left a brass letter opener in the shape of a quill. When she touched it, the metal was warm. She did not pick it up. She sat on the edge of the hearth and read her grandmother's christening entry on her phone, because even in the presence of the past, the present writes the footnotes. Miriam Lydia Harrow, born 1957, mother Ruth Ansell, father unknown. Ansell, her mother's maiden name, had been taken from a woman who raised other people's children for wages and kept her own on margins. Before that, the record blurred. The parish registers of 3 villages gave up entries and then gave up altogether, as if a hand had turned away on purpose. She returned to the ledger when the light thinned toward evening. The last page remained what it had been. Her name lay across the center like a door you could not walk around. She traced, not touching, the path from Lydia to Miriam, and tried to imagine the interim. Women who changed their names the way a person changes lanes in fog, men who left coins and no faces, children counted and then counted out. The book did not explain. It never had. It recorded. Under the lamp on her kitchen table, she began to pull at the threads. Lydia Harrow, 1812. No burial recorded in Whitcombe's ground. A notice in a county paper from 1813. Run away from her service. A girl of 17. Slim, dark hair. Answers to L.H. reward, 5 guineas. The notice had been placed by E. Whitcombe, Esq. The wording did not name the nature of the service. 2 years later, in an apprenticeship register from the next county over, L.H., seamstress's apprentice, age 19, guardian unnamed. At the side of the page, a small ink blot where someone's nib had paused too long. After that, silence for 20 years. Then, Ruth Harrow, appearing in a poorhouse ledger, no husband listed. 2 children, Miriam and Elias. A mark beside the name in the margin that meant paid by private arrangement. No note of who arranged it. The line from ledger to ledger was not a line at all, but a series of footsteps remembered by the floor. Yet it ended here, at Miriam's own table, with a book that wrote her. She thought of the Latin carved into the old end papers. All debts are paid in blood. She thought of how debt travels, how it finds heirs when it cannot find payers, how it calls itself a principle to avoid the word hunger. At noon the next day, the solicitor telephoned. His voice had acquired something like human weather. "You saw it?" he asked. "I did." "I hoped you wouldn't," he said, and then caught himself. "That is, not yet. Miss Anstruther believed you'd realize the correspondence. She said you might seek counsel with those who keep custody." "Custody of what?" He cleared his throat. "Of instruments not suitable for lending. The county archive, Vault 3. A pause. "They have a protocol. If you show them the final page, they will advise." The archivist on duty was a woman in her 60s, with the look of someone who was being outnumbered by paper and survived. When Miriam presented the box and the page, the woman's hands did not go to her mouth. They went to the phone. After a time, a man arrived who did not give his name. He examined the ledger as a doctor examines a wound he recognizes from older wars. "There are 3 volumes in all," he said. 2 held here. The 3rd passed hand to hand until Miss Anstruther returned it. You have it now. We had hoped. Well, hope is an amateur's game." "What is this?" Miriam asked. "A prank that outlived its prankster. A ledger that writes back." The man smiled, with the part of his mouth that had seen courts. "It is a record of obligations, Dr. Harrow. Whitcombe wrote what others promised him to save themselves. Land, seasons, names. The book keeps account of what has not been paid. Sometimes the book—" He hesitated, then continued, "anticipates." "Anticipates what?" "The next surety," the archivist said quietly. "The one who will keep the promise when the original cannot." Miriam closed her eyes. She saw the orchard where Lydia had been seen last, hands stained. She saw the runaway notice posted by a man who called debt virtue. She saw her grandmother's name in a poorhouse ledger, next to a private arrangement. She saw herself in a book older than her house, written without her consent. "What does it want?" she asked. "Accounts do not want," the man said. "They balance." "Against what?" "Against the measure given," the archivist said. Whitcombe was particular. If a man gave his harvest, the book tallied bushels. If a woman gave her years, the book tallied years. There is an entry. She glanced at the page where Lydia had bled through. That implies time was promised on her behalf. Time she did not live long enough to surrender. Miriam thought of the blank beneath her name like a cup not yet filled. She did not ask how much. She knew a trap when it wore arithmetic as perfume. That night, the temperature fell. In her kitchen, a thin frost filmed the rim of a glass she had forgotten to dry. The ledger lay closed, but the room had the feeling of an open grave. Tidy, deliberate, waiting. She dreamed of ink, not the color of ink, but its temperature, the way it cools under a lamp while your hand warms the paper around it. She dreamed she was seated at Whitcomb's desk, a quill balanced in her fingers, the nib tap-tapping in a rhythm that matched her pulse. She did not write. The page wrote itself, her name again, then a date, November 12th, not this year, the next. The line beneath, empty. She woke to the sound of her own heart insisting upon continuance. In the morning she took the ledger into the light and saw nothing new. That is how these things console. They let daylight call them false. She spent a day with maps. The estate boundaries had shrunk, then dissolved, then reappeared as modern parcels. She traced the line of the old orchard, the servant cottages, the mill. At the mill on the plan, someone's hand had written, "Keep out." The note was modern, the ink cheap. She went there at dusk. The mill was a roofless jaw. The river that had powered it whispered under a raft of leaves. On a stone beside the wheel pit, someone had carved initials, shallow and hurried, LH. The stone was not old enough to be Lydia's, no more than 50 years, weathered, and yet the letters looked like a hollow inside the stone, as if cut from within. Below the initials, another set, scraped more recently with a metal point, MH. She did not remember coming here as a girl, but the habit of a family is a river. If you drink from it, it will recognize you whether you learn its name or not. On the walk back to the lane, she realized she was not afraid. Fear requires a belief that you might run. She understood that the book would be where she was. Houses do not haunt. Accounts do. Back at the flat, she set a piece of paper beside the ledger and wrote, slowly, "This account is closed." The words looked thin. She crossed them out and wrote, "This account is contested." The law has always loved that verb, polite violence in passive voice. She left the note there and turned the page of the ledger to cover it, as if the book might be forced to read. At midnight, the radiator released a clank, like a dropped chain. The ledger lifted one corner of itself in the draft, then settled. Miriam went to the window. Frost had mapped the glass in a lattice so delicate that breath alone could undo it. She exhaled and watched the pattern vanish in a clean circle that did not refreeze. In the morning, beneath her name, a single mark had appeared. Not a number, not a date. A small black cross, identical to those beside the oldest entries. It was as neat as prayer, and as unanswerable. She took the ledger back to the archives because some burdens are meant to be borne by rooms. The archivist met her at the door and did not ask to see it. "We will keep it cold," she said. "Cold slows ink." Miriam nodded. "And then?" "Then," the older woman said, "we look for the page that cancels another. It is what we have. Paper to fight paper." On her walk home, she passed a boy dragging a stick along a fence, making a sound like a zipper opening the day. She realized she'd been listening for footsteps behind her and had not heard any. She realized, too, that silence can be accompaniment. That night, she wrote letters to no one and addressed them to air. She listed what she owed and to whom. To the grandmother who could not account for a father. To the women whose names were paid in years. To a girl who ran from a house that kept perfect books. She sealed the letters and burned them one by one over the sink. The ash caught to her sleeve and left a smudge like a bruise. When she slept, she did not dream. In the morning, the ledger remained at the archive, and her table was simply a table. The blank beneath her name persisted in the mind where paper cannot be chilled. On November 12th, she went to Whitcombe as the light went thin. She stood where the orchard had been and counted the breaths, between crows calling and quiet. "Lydia," she said, the first time she had given the past a mouth, "I am not your debtor. I am your kin." The wind moved in the hawthorns, as if a hand brushed them back. Somewhere a fox made its small bark and felt enormous for it. When she returned home, a slip waited under her door. It was from the archive, a line only, "Come at once." They had found something in the second volume, pressed between pages like a flower that had once been necessary and then forgotten. A receipt, dated 1812, in Whitcomb's hand. Received from E. Whitcombe the sum of 40 guineas for the release of time pledged by L. Harrow, same to be returned in the event of her safe conveyance, beyond his reach. Beneath, a signature not Whitcomb's, a woman's hand, steady as a shore, Eleanor Anstruther. The archivist smiled without showing teeth. The estate that kept you keeps receipts. It appears Miss Anstruther's kin bought a debt out from under the collector and buried the proof. The book did not record it, but the paper did. Miriam felt a weight slide a fraction inside her chest, as stone shifts when frost leaves it. Will this? She touched the receipt, as if it were the arm of a chair. Be enough? Enough is a word for Summers, the archivist said. But it is a countermeasure. We will place it where the ledger can see. Books remember what we tell them, if we have the right ink. They placed the receipt beneath Miriam's name and closed the ledger upon it, like a mouth, reconsidering what it had chewed. The vault door shut. The cold did its work. For 3 nights, Miriam woke to nothing at all. On the 4th, she woke because she had slept. She went to the archive at noon. The ledger lay open under glass. On the last page, beneath Miriam Lydia Harrow, the small cross had been struck through, not erased, not blotted, a neat line drawn once horizontal, as if a clerk somewhere had been told to mark paid, but had not been authorized the dignity of the stamp. There was room, still, below. There is always room. But the blank looked less like a mouth and more like a scar. On her way out, the archivist touched her sleeve. You understand, she said, that you have not ended anything. You have continued differently. I know, Miriam said. The account continues. She stepped into the afternoon and felt the small astonishment of being the age you are, and not another. The clouds broke and closed like a hand considering mercy. The old estate kept its distance. The river took in what it was given and altered nothing of its face. When she reached her flat, the cedar box waited where she had left it. She lifted the lid and found, beneath the black silk, a second folded note she had not seen. The paper had thinned to a translucence that made the words seem to float on air. What is remembered is never owed. The hand was the same as the first. EEA. The dead advising as the living do, briefly, without apology. She placed the note with the receipt and left them both where paper teaches the future to read. When the archive lights dim for the night, the rooms remember more than the curators ever could. That winter, the cold crept into the vaults earlier than usual. The temperature sensors clicked, the air dried, and the books began to whisper not with sound, but with the faint settling of old paper exhaling the weight of what it holds. The Whitcombe Ledgers were kept in the lowest chamber, Vault 3, where the walls were thick enough to forget the weather. It was there, 2 nights after the receipt had been filed beneath Miriam Harrow's name, that something shifted. At first, it was a scent. Not decay, not yet, but something like iron and salt, faint as breath on glass. Then, in the logbook at the guard's desk, an entry appeared in handwriting that matched no one on staff. Account balanced, awaiting reconciliation. The guard thought little of it. He assumed one of the archivists had left it as a note for cataloging. But the word reconciliation echoed in his mind long after he had locked the vault. Miriam returned 3 days later. The archivist greeted her with the cautious kindness reserved for those who have already seen too much. She led Miriam to Vault 3, the cold following them like a dog that knew its name. The glass case stood as before, but the ledger was open to a new page. There were no fingerprints on the lid, no sign of entry, and yet the book had turned itself. On the exposed page was a single word, written in that same tight, disciplined hand. Witness. Though the ink was wet. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Then the archivist whispered, "Sometimes they turn their own pages. When the story isn't done." Miriam stared through the glass, watching her reflection blur with the shadows behind it. "I thought it was finished," she said. The archivist smiled sadly. "Books that hold blood never finish. They only pause between signatures." That evening, Miriam asked to review the other volumes. The archivist hesitated but agreed, unlocking a drawer marked Restricted Holdings Private Accounts. Inside were 2 older books, their covers cracked, their ribbons stiff with age. Each bore the same crest, the stylized W, of Whitcombe's hand. But these ledgers were not English. One bore the stamp of Amsterdam, 1714. The other, Bremen, 1672. Both contained entries written in Whitcombe's same precise script. That was impossible. "Copies?" Miriam asked. The archivist shook her head. "They were catalogued before your Whitcombe was even born." Miriam flipped to a random page. The ink had darkened to brown, but the names were clear. Merchants, sailors, clergymen, all crossed, with the same small mark. And there, near the bottom of one list, was a name that chilled her more than all the rest. E. Whitcombe. He had written himself into the book centuries before his life began. Miriam spent nights at the archive after that, sitting among the ledgers while others went home. She began to notice that the handwriting, perfect and calm, grew smaller the later the hour grew. Sometimes she thought she heard the soft rasp of a quill. Sometimes she caught the smell of iron again. She never lit the lamp to check. In her journal, she wrote, "The ledger is not an object. It is a method. It copies its maker, and its maker is debt itself." Then came the storm. A power failure rolled through the district, blacking out the archive for 23 minutes. When light returned, the alarms were silent, but the vault doors stood open. Only one thing had moved the ledger. It sat on the central table, open at a page near its end. There was no new name this time. Instead, written across the width of the paper, in strokes uneven and desperate, was a sentence that neither woman could explain. "Ink is only the shadow of blood." The words would not fade. They could not be removed, not even by the preservation chemicals designed to lift ink. It remained stark, glossy, alive. The archivist wanted to seal the ledger permanently, but Miriam stopped her. "If it wants witness," she said, "we should let it speak." And so she spent another night in the vault. Alone, wrapped in her coat, notebook open beside her. At midnight, the pages began to move again, not turning, but breathing, the fibers flexing, the leather binding sighing with soft clicks. Then, faintly, across the surface of the page, letters formed like frost patterns. They spelled only one phrase: debitum memorandum. The debt remembered. By morning, the words had faded again, but when Miriam left the vault, she found a new envelope slid under the door. No seal, no address. Inside was a photograph, black and white, taken decades ago. It showed a small reading room lined with steel cases. In the center sat a man in archivist's uniform, his face turned away. On the table before him, the same ledger. The photograph was dated 1912. On the back was scrawled a note. "Do not mistake silence for rest." Later, reviewing the old staff registers, Miriam found no record of an archivist by that description. But his uniform, she noticed, bore a small embroidered crest. Not of the archive, of Whitcombe Hall. The estate had burned in 1887. That night, she dreamed again of ink. This time she stood in the orchard, frost glittering on the grass. In the distance, she saw the mill, and beyond it, the river. A single figure waited by the water, a woman with hair unbound, holding a book close to her chest. When she turned, her face was Miriam's own. She woke with the taste of salt on her lips and found a drop of dark liquid staining her pillow. It wasn't blood. It wasn't ink. It was both. The next day, the archivist locked the vault. The ledgers were sealed in glass, tagged for indefinite retention. But even now, when the night is long enough and the building empty, a single red light on the security camera blinks twice instead of once. And in that moment, the glass fogs faintly, as though something behind it breathes. Because debts, once written, are not forgotten. They wait. They adapt. They learn new hands to hold their pens. For months, the Gothic Ledger slept under glass. Miriam Harrow continued her life as if the past could be catalogued like paper, sorted, numbered, and contained. But history, once it recognizes you, doesn't forget your face. The nightmares returned first. Always the same, a monastery cloaked in snow, monks walking in single file across a courtyard where no footprints remained. She would wake with the sound of chanting still in her ears, low, rhythmic, half prayer, half arithmetic. When she looked up the melody later, she found no record of it anywhere. In late spring, the archives received a delivery from the ruins of Greyfriars Abbey, unearthed during renovations. Among the objects was a small warped tablet bound in what the inventory called vellum of unknown composition. It contained 2 columns of names written in Latin and a faint watermark at the top, a stylized W. Miriam froze. She requested access under the pretext of cataloging continuity and carried the object into the light. It wasn't vellum. It was thinner. Too smooth, almost translucent. The ink had faded to brown, but she recognized the script instantly. The same hand that had written the Whitcombe Ledger centuries later. At the bottom of the page, a line in Latin read, "Debium in silentio oritur." Debt is born from silence. She began tracing the abbey's history. Founded in 1423, dissolved in 1538, then rebuilt in partial ruin as a debtor's hospice, a place where the sick and destitute were taken to die in anonymity. The monks there had been known not for their charity, but for their records. Every death was accounted for, every sin transcribed and balanced against penance. They believed that numbers could redeem the soul, that if the sum of prayer equaled the sum of guilt, salvation could be mathematically achieved. When their monastery fell, the abbot fled with the ledgers. He took them north, beyond record. The trail ended there, until Edmund Whitcombe, 3 centuries later, appeared in the parish rolls of Yorkshire, educated, orphaned, and already in possession of certain monastic documents. The handwriting had not changed. That night, Miriam stood before the sealed case in Vault 3. She pressed her hand to the glass, and for the first time the cold met her halfway. She whispered, "Who taught you to write?" For a moment, nothing. Then, faintly, the lights in the vault flickered, and a line of condensation appeared where her palm had rested. It ran downward, like the slow descent of ink. In the morning, the archivist found the glass open. No alarm had sounded. Inside, the ledger was gone. In its place lay a scrap of the Abbey vellum, folded once. On it, 3 words in Latin. Finis sed manet. It ends, but remains. For 2 weeks, there was no sign of the book. Then, on a quiet Sunday evening, the curator of the British Library called the archives. A parcel had arrived in the reading room. No sender, no postage, just a cedar box with a single label, "To be shelved under H." Inside was the ledger, its cover darker now, as if freshly oiled. When opened, the first half was unchanged, but the final page was filled. There, beneath Miriam Lydia Harrow, a new entry had appeared, "Custos the Keeper," dated the day the vault was opened. The handwriting was hers. Miriam denied writing it. But the archivist noticed the way she paused whenever the box was mentioned, as though measuring breath against weight. Soon after, she resigned her position. She left the city for a coastal village where history washed itself clean each tide. She rented a small cottage and filled it with nothing that could record. No books, no journals, no letters. But even silence keeps minutes. The ledger stayed locked away until the day an intern preparing a display on early accounting practices requested access. The archivist refused at first, then relented. When they lifted the case lid, the pages were blank. Every name, every mark, every drop of ink gone. Only the faint indentations of writing remained, visible if the light hit just so. They decided it was a chemical reaction, a failure of preservation. But as they sealed the book again, one of them noticed something pressed into the leather of the cover, a single fresh fingerprint. Years later, in 2021, a researcher digitizing the archives found an audio file mislabeled in the collection. No metadata, no date. It began with a low static hum, then a woman's voice. "This is Dr. Miriam Harrow. The ledger no longer writes in ink. It writes in memory. If you're hearing this, it's already begun again." The recording ends with a sound that's neither page nor breath. A faint scratch, like a quill tracing the first letter of a new name. And somewhere, in a locked vault that no one claims to have opened, a single line waits at the bottom of an empty page. The account continues.